The blood was still fresh on her forehead when I realized I was about to marry the most dangerous woman in all of England. The crimson mark glistened in the dim candlelight of the ruined chapel, a brand that condemned her as surely as if she wore a noose around her neck. Yet here I stood, Lysander Thornwick, 28 years old and heir to nothing but trouble, speaking vows that would either save us both or damn us together. The chapel had seen better centuries. Ivy crawled through gaps in the stone walls where stained glass windows once caught the morning light, and weeds pushed up between the flagstones beneath our feet. Father Aldrich's withered hands trembled as he held the prayer book, his Latin whispers barely audible above the autumn wind that howled through the broken roof. This was not how I had imagined my wedding day, but then again, nothing about loving Gwyneth Ravenscroft had gone according to plan. She stood beside me, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders, the government brand still raw against her pale skin. 3 days ago, she had been the most sought-after young woman in our county. Today, she was marked property of the crown, sentenced to burn for the crime of keeping her faith. The irony wasn't lost on me that in this moment, surrounded by the ruins of what had once been a Catholic sanctuary, we were attempting something that might be our salvation or our final act of defiance. I'd love to know where in the world are you watching this from. Drop your location in the comments below. Let me tell you how it all began, because understanding the beginning is the only way to grasp the madness of that moment. It was late summer when I first saw Gwyneth, though I had heard her name whispered in drawing rooms and taverns for months. The Ravenscroft family had moved to our village from the north, bringing with them a fortune made in wool and a daughter whose beauty was matched only by her discretion. In Queen Elizabeth's England, discretion was a virtue that could keep you alive. I remember the exact moment our eyes met across the village square. She was helping her maid carry baskets from the market, her blue dress simple but well-made, her movements graceful despite the weight she carried. When she looked up and caught me staring, she didn't blush or look away as most young ladies would. Instead, she held my gaze for just a heartbeat longer than propriety allowed, and in that moment, I felt something shift inside my chest like a key turning in a long-locked door. My family, the Thornwicks, had owned land in this corner of England for 3 generations, though we were hardly among the great nobles. We were what you might call comfortable gentry, wealthy enough to matter in our small world but poor enough to remember what it felt like to worry about the future. My father had died 2 winters prior, leaving me the estate and the responsibility that came with it. At 28, I was considered something of a catch for the local families with daughters to marry off, though I had shown little interest in any of them until Gwyneth arrived. The Ravenscrofts rented the old Miller house on the edge of town, a stone cottage with a thatched roof and gardens that had been neglected for years. Within weeks of their arrival, Gwyneth had transformed those gardens into something magical, with roses climbing the walls and herbs growing in neat rows that filled the air with their fragrance. I found excuses to ride past their house almost daily, hoping for glimpses of her tending her plants or reading beneath the old oak tree in their yard. It took me nearly a month to work up the courage to speak to her properly. The opportunity came during harvest time, when the entire village gathered to help bring in the wheat. Tradition demanded that everyone contribute, from the wealthiest landowner to the humblest servant, and the work was followed by a feast that lasted well into the night. I saw Gwyneth working alongside the other women, her sleeves rolled up despite the September heat, her face flushed with exertion and laughter. When the work was done and the dancing began, I finally approached her. She was standing slightly apart from the crowd, watching the festivities with a smile that seemed both joyful and somehow distant. I offered her my hand, and she accepted it without hesitation. We danced 3 dances that night, which was just enough to set tongues wagging but not enough to cause a scandal. Her hand was soft but strong in mine, and when she spoke, her voice carried a musical quality that made even simple words sound like poetry. She told me about her love of gardening, how she had learned the properties of herbs from her grandmother, and how she found peace in working with growing things. I told her about my travels to London, my plans for improving the estate, and my secret dream of writing poetry, though I had never shared that ambition with another soul. We talked as if we had known each other for years rather than minutes, and when the evening ended, I knew my life had changed forever. Over the following weeks, I found reasons to visit the Ravenscroft household regularly. Sometimes I brought gifts from my orchards, apples and pears that I claimed were too abundant for my own household to consume. Other times, I simply happened to be riding past when Gwyneth was in her garden, and she would invite me to stay for tea. Her parents, Merchant Ravenscroft and his wife, seemed pleased by my attention to their daughter, though I noticed they were always careful to ensure we were properly chaperoned. It was during one of these visits that I first noticed something unusual about the Ravenscroft household. I had arrived earlier than expected and found Gwyneth's maid, Tabitha, quickly hiding what looked like a small silver crucifix. The girl's face went pale when she saw me, and she stammered some excuse about cleaning. Gwyneth appeared a moment later, her smile as warm as always, but I caught a flicker of something in her eyes, worry perhaps, or fear. In those days, such signs were dangerous to ignore. England under Queen Elizabeth was officially Protestant, and while the Queen herself was more tolerant than some who came before her, the political situation made Catholics suspect. Spain remained our enemy, and every Catholic in England was seen as a potential agent of foreign powers. The penalties for practicing the old faith ranged from heavy fines to imprisonment, and in cases of treason, death. But I was falling in love, and love makes men willing to overlook what wisdom would have them notice. When Gwyneth and I walked in her garden, when we sat by the fire in her family's parlor discussing books and dreams, when she laughed at my terrible attempts at poetry, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. I told myself that whatever secrets the Ravenscroft family might harbor were none of my concern as long as they brought no harm to anyone. I was a fool to think love could exist in a bubble, protected from the harsh realities of our time. The first crack in our perfect world came on a gray October morning when Magistrate Cornelius Widmore arrived in our village with a company of armed men and a mandate from the Crown to investigate reports of Catholic activities in the region. Widmore was a man who wore his authority like armor, his black robes and stern expression designed to intimidate before he even spoke a word. He had made his reputation rooting out what he called the papist infection in the southern counties, and his arrival sent a chill through our community that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. I watched from my manor house as his men set up their headquarters in the village inn, and I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach like a stone. The investigation began with public announcements and rewards for information. Widmore stood in the village square, his voice carrying across the crowd, as he outlined the Crown's position on religious conformity. Anyone harboring Catholic priests, he declared, anyone possessing Catholic books or artifacts, anyone who failed to attend Anglican services regularly, would face the full weight of English law. The penalties, he described, made grown men pale, and women clutch their children closer. Within days, neighbors were reporting neighbors, servants were betraying their masters, and decades-old grudges were being settled under the guise of religious purity. The atmosphere in our once peaceful village became poisonous with suspicion and fear. I tried to convince myself that the Ravenscrofts would be safe, that their careful attendance at our Protestant church and their public conformity would protect them, but deep in my heart, I knew better. The first direct threat came in the form of anonymous accusations. Someone, and we never learned who, had reported seeing suspicious activity around the Miller house. Candlelight in windows at unusual hours, they claimed, and the sound of Latin prayers carried on the wind. Widmore's men began watching the Ravenscroft household, noting who came and went, following Gwyneth when she walked to market, questioning the local priest about the family's attendance at services. I found Gwyneth in her garden one morning, kneeling among the dying roses with tears streaming down her face. The autumn frost had claimed most of her flowers, and she was trying to save what little remained, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pruning shears. When she saw me approaching, she wiped her eyes quickly and tried to smile, but the fear in her expression was impossible to hide. She looked at me then with such desperate hope in her eyes, and whispered something that changed everything I thought I knew about courage. She told me the truth, the whole truth, about who her family really was and what they believed. Her grandmother had indeed taught her about herbs, but she had also taught her the old prayers, the Latin masses, the rituals that connected her to generations of faithful Catholics who had kept their beliefs alive in secret. The Ravenscrofts attended our Protestant church every Sunday, but they also gathered in their home on holy days to remember the faith of their ancestors. I should have been shocked. I should have been angry that she had deceived me. Instead, I felt something I had never experienced before, a fierce protective instinct that overwhelmed every other consideration. This woman, this gentle soul who spent her days nurturing growing things and bringing beauty into the world, was being hunted like a criminal for the simple act of believing in something larger than herself. The injustice of it burned in my chest like acid. But knowing the truth and being able to protect her were two different things entirely. Widmore's investigation was thorough and relentless, and he had resources at his disposal that I could never match. When I tried to use my position as a local landowner to deflect attention from the Ravenscrofts, he reminded me coldly that harboring known Catholics was itself a crime punishable by death. My choice, he made clear, was to cooperate with his investigation or become part of it. The net closed around them slowly but inexorably. A former servant, dismissed months earlier for theft, came forward with detailed descriptions of Catholic books hidden in the house. A traveling merchant claimed to have seen Father Aldrich, the old priest who had performed secret masses in the region for decades, entering the Miller house at night. Most damning of all, a search of their property revealed a hidden compartment containing rosary beads, a Latin Bible, and a small silver crucifix that Tabitha had failed to hide completely. The evidence was overwhelming, and Widmore moved swiftly to make arrests. I was returning from a neighboring estate when I saw the smoke rising from the direction of the village, and I spurred my horse into a gallop, knowing in my heart what I would find. The Miller house was burning, set ablaze by Widmore's men as they dragged the Ravenscroft family from their home. Neighbors stood watching in horrified silence as everything Gwyneth had built, her beautiful gardens and peaceful sanctuary, was consumed by flames that seemed to reach toward the gray autumn sky like accusing fingers. They had already taken her father and mother to the county jail when I arrived, but Gwyneth was still there, kneeling in the dirt of her ruined garden with her hands bound behind her back. Widmore himself stood over her, holding a red-hot iron brand shaped like the letter H. For Heretic, he explained to the assembled crowd, a mark that would identify her as an enemy of the true faith for whatever remained of her life. I tried to intervene, stepping forward and demanding that he stop, but his guards held me back as he pressed the iron to her forehead. The sound she made, a sharp intake of breath that was not quite a scream, will haunt me until my dying day. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the smoke from her burning home, and I watched the woman I loved being transformed into a marked criminal before my eyes. Yet even in that moment of agony, she did not beg or plead. She met Widmore's eyes with a dignity that made him look away first. The trial, if it could be called that, was a foregone conclusion. Widmore had his evidence, his witnesses, and his mandate from the crown. The Ravenscrofts were found guilty of practicing Catholic rituals, possessing forbidden religious materials, and harboring a Catholic priest. The sentences were death by burning for all three, to be carried out in 3 days' time as an example to anyone else who might be tempted to defy English law. I spent those 3 days in a kind of desperate frenzy, calling in every favor I had, writing letters to anyone with influence, even considering an appeal directly to the Queen herself. But I was one minor landowner in a kingdom where such executions happened daily, and my efforts came to nothing. The machinery of religious persecution ground forward with mechanical precision, and there seemed to be no way to stop it. It was on the second night, as I sat in my study staring at the fire and contemplating the unthinkable idea of simply accepting defeat, that I remembered something my father had told me years before about English marriage law. A married woman, he had said, could not be compelled to testify against herself in certain circumstances, and there were precedents for married women being treated more leniently than unmarried ones in religious cases. The idea was desperate, probably hopeless, but it was the only chance I could see. The plan that formed in my mind was so audacious, so fraught with danger, that I almost dismissed it as the fantasy of a desperate man. But as I sat there in the darkness, listening to the wind rattle the windows of my ancestral home, I realized that desperate times called for desperate measures. If I could somehow marry Gwyneth before her execution, there might be legal grounds for a stay of proceedings, perhaps even a commutation of her sentence. It was a slim hope, but it was hope nonetheless. The first challenge was gaining access to her. Widmore had ordered the prisoners held in the old Norman tower that served as our county jail, a stone fortress that had been built to withstand sieges, not to be infiltrated by lovesick fools. But I had one advantage that Widmore could never have anticipated. As the son of a local landowner, I had played in and around that tower as a boy, and I knew its secrets better than its current guards. There was a drainage tunnel that ran beneath the foundation, built centuries ago to prevent the basement from flooding during heavy rains. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, and it emptied into the river that ran behind the village. If I could reach that tunnel entrance, I might be able to get inside the tower without being seen. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was watching the woman I loved burn alive in 2 days' time. I waited until the darkest hour before dawn, when the guards would be at their sleepiest and the village would be wrapped in silence. The autumn night was bitter cold, with frost forming on the grass and my breath visible in white puffs as I made my way through the shadows. I had dressed in dark clothes and carried only a small leather bag containing the few items I thought we might need: a rope, a knife, and most importantly, a purse full of gold coins. The tunnel was worse than I remembered, filled with decades of accumulated debris, and so narrow in places that I had to exhale completely to squeeze through. The stone walls were slick with moisture and something that might have been moss, and more than once I found myself stuck, panic rising in my throat as I struggled to free myself. But thoughts of Gwyneth kept me moving forward, crawling through the darkness toward what might be our only chance at salvation. When I finally emerged into the tower's basement, I was filthy, exhausted, and bleeding from a dozen scrapes, but I was inside. The basement was used for storage, filled with barrels of grain and bundles of straw, and the thick stone walls muffled any sound I might make. Above me, I could hear the occasional footstep of a guard making his rounds, but the building felt mostly asleep. I had memorized the tower's layout from my childhood explorations, and I knew that the cells were on the second floor, accessible by a narrow stone stairway that wound around the building's central support. Each step seemed to echo like thunder in my ears, though I tried to move as silently as possible. If I was discovered now, before I could reach Gwyneth, both of us would die together, and our deaths would accomplish nothing. The guard posted outside the cells was an older man named Willem, someone I had known since childhood. He was dozing in his chair when I reached the second floor, his head nodded forward, and a flask of ale beside him that explained his drowsiness. I approached him carefully, my hand on the purse of gold coins, and whispered his name softly. When he looked up, startled and confused, I quickly explained that I was there on official business, and placed the coins in his palm. Willem was not a bad man, just a poor one with a family to feed, and the gold I offered him was more money than he would see in a year of guard duty. He listened as I spun a tale about needing to question the prisoners privately on behalf of certain influential people, who preferred not to be named. It was a thin story, but backed by enough gold to make it believable, and Willem was in no position to ask too many questions. The cell where they held Gwyneth was a cramped stone chamber, with a single barred window set high in the wall. She was sitting on a pile of straw when I entered, and the sight of her nearly broke my resolve. The brand on her forehead was still raw and painful looking, and she had grown thin during her imprisonment, but her eyes still held that same quiet dignity that had first attracted me to her. When she saw me, her face went through a series of emotions: surprise, joy, fear, and finally resignation. She stood up slowly, moving to the bars that separated us, and reached through to touch my face with trembling fingers. She whispered my name like a prayer, and asked me what I was doing there, though I think she already suspected the answer. I told her about my plan, speaking quickly and quietly, so that Willem would not overhear the details. Marriage, I explained, might provide legal protection that could save her life. It was not guaranteed, and it would certainly put my own life at risk, but it was the only option I could see. As I spoke, I watched her face carefully, looking for any sign of hope or agreement. What she told me next revealed the true depth of her character and her faith. She looked at me with eyes full of tears, and said that while she was grateful beyond words for my willingness to risk everything for her, she could not ask me to throw away my life for a plan that would probably fail. She had made her peace with her fate, she said, and she would rather die knowing that I was safe than live knowing that I had been destroyed trying to save her. But I had not come this far to be turned away by noble self-sacrifice. I took her hands through the bars, and told her something that I had never said to another human being. I told her that I loved her, not just with the passion of a young man infatuated with a beautiful woman, but with a deep, abiding love that comes from truly knowing another person's soul. I told her that my life without her would be no life at all, just a series of empty days stretching toward a meaningless end. She began to weep then, quietly but with an intensity that shook her whole body. She told me that she loved me too, had loved me almost from the moment we met, but had never dared to hope that someone like me could love someone like her. In a world that condemned her for her faith, she said, I had shown her that there was still goodness and kindness to be found, and that knowledge had been her greatest comfort during these dark days. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly easy. We would attempt the marriage, despite all the risks and uncertainties. If it failed, we would at least have had these few moments together as husband and wife. If it succeeded, we would face whatever came next as a united front. Either way, we would not let fear and hatred have the final word in our story. The practical challenges were immense. We needed a priest willing to perform an illegal ceremony, a location where we could gather without being discovered, and some way to get Gwyneth out of her cell without raising alarms that would bring Widmore's entire force down on us. Most difficult of all, we needed to accomplish all of this in less than 36 hours, before her scheduled execution. Willem, it turned out, was more helpful than I had dared to hope. The gold I had given him was only part of his motivation. He had a daughter about Gwyneth's age, and the thought of any young woman being burned alive for her beliefs troubled his conscience more than he cared to admit. Willem agreed to help us escape, but only if we could guarantee that he would not be blamed for Gwyneth's disappearance. We devised a plan where he would report that bandits had attacked the tower in the early morning hours, overpowering him and making off with the prisoner. It was believable enough. Highway robbery was common in our region, and Widmore would have no reason to suspect the truth if we moved quickly enough. Finding a priest willing to perform the ceremony was more challenging. The local Anglican minister would never agree to marry a condemned heretic, and approaching him would only expose our plan. But I remembered Father Aldrich, the old Catholic priest who had been mentioned during the trial, as having performed secret masses in the region. If he was still alive and hiding somewhere nearby, he might be our only hope. Tabitha, Gwyneth's loyal maid, had been released after questioning since the authorities found no evidence that she had participated in Catholic rituals. She knew where Father Aldrich might be found, hidden in a shepherd's hut deep in the forest beyond the village. It was dangerous for her to contact him, but she agreed to try, moved by the same desperate love for her mistress that drove my own actions. The old priest was indeed alive, though he had aged years in the weeks since going into hiding. When Tabitha brought him to meet me in the ruins of the ancient chapel where we had decided to hold the ceremony, I saw a man who had been broken by persecution but not defeated by it. His hands shook with palsy or fear, his clothes were little more than rags, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much suffering. But when I explained what we planned to do, those eyes lit up with something that might have been hope. He looked at me for a long moment, studying my face as if trying to see into my soul, before he spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, but his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. He told me that in his 50 years of serving God, he had seen love triumph over hatred more often than the world might believe. If I was willing to risk everything for this woman, if I understood that this marriage might mean exile, poverty, or death, then he would perform the ceremony and pray that God would bless what man had condemned. The timing had to be perfect. Willem would create the distraction just before dawn, when the guards changed shifts, and there would be maximum confusion. In the chaos that followed, Gwyneth and I would make our way to the ruined chapel, where Father Aldrich would be waiting. The ceremony itself would take only minutes, but we would need to have witnesses who could later testify to its validity. Tabitha had agreed to serve as one witness, and I had convinced my own valet, a man named Marcus, who had served my family faithfully for 20 years, to serve as the other. If you're finding yourself drawn into this story, make sure you're subscribed because you won't want to miss what happens next. The night before the planned escape, I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was making the right choice. I thought about my father, who had spent his life building our family's position in the community, and how he would have reacted to my decision to throw it all away for love. I thought about the comfortable future I was abandoning, the children I might never have if this plan failed, the legacy that would die with me if Widmore discovered our deception. But then I thought about Gwyneth, alone in her cold stone cell, facing death, with a courage that shamed every comfortable compromise I had ever made. I thought about the gentleness with which she tended her garden, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about the things she loved, the quiet faith that sustained her even in the darkest circumstances. I realized that a life without her, no matter how comfortable or secure, would be no life at all. The morning of the escape dawned gray and cold, with low clouds that promised rain before noon. I dressed carefully in my finest clothes, as if I were attending a wedding at court rather than a desperate ceremony in a ruined chapel. If this was to be my wedding day, I reasoned, I would at least look the part of a proper bridegroom. I pinned a small silver brooch to my doublet, a family heirloom that my father had worn on his own wedding day, and tried to convince myself that he would have understood my choice. Willem's distraction worked perfectly. At exactly dawn, he began shouting about bandits, and sounding the alarm bell that brought every guard in the tower running. In the confusion that followed, with men stumbling about in the dim morning light, and orders being shouted from every direction, no one noticed one small figure slipping away through the drainage tunnel I had shown her the night before. I met Gwyneth at the edge of the forest, and the sight of her nearly took my breath away. Despite everything she had endured, despite the brand on her forehead and the simple prison clothes she wore, she looked more beautiful to me in that moment than she ever had in all our previous meetings. There was something in her expression, a mixture of hope and determination and absolute trust in me, that made me feel simultaneously humble and invincible. We made our way through the forest quickly but carefully, avoiding the main paths where we might encounter other travelers or Whitmore search parties. The woods were thick with mist that morning, and more than once we lost our way, but eventually we found the clearing where the ruins of the old chapel stood like broken teeth against the sky. The chapel had been built centuries ago by Norman lords, but it had been abandoned during the Reformation when Henry VIII broke with Rome. Nature had begun to reclaim it. Ivy covered the walls, and small trees grew up through gaps in the floor, but the basic structure remained sound. The altar still stood at the eastern end, though the cross that had once crowned it was long gone, and enough of the roof remained to provide some protection from the weather. Father Aldrich was waiting for us, dressed in the simple robes he had managed to preserve through years of hiding. He had brought a small wooden cross and a worn prayer book, the tools of his forbidden trade, and he had arranged them on the ruined altar with a reverence that transformed the broken space into something sacred. Tabitha and Marcus stood nearby, both of them pale with fear, but determined to see this through to the end. The ceremony itself was unlike any wedding I had ever attended. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration waiting afterward, only the four of us standing in a circle of candlelight, while Father Aldrich spoke the ancient words that would bind Gwyneth and me together as husband and wife. His voice was strong despite his frail appearance, and the Latin phrases seemed to echo in the ruined space as if the very stones were bearing witness to our union. When it came time for the vows, I looked into Gwyneth's eyes, and spoke from my heart rather than from any prepared text. I promised to love her and protect her for as long as I drew breath, to stand with her against whatever trials might come, and to never let fear or hatred separate us from each other or from the faith that had brought us together in this moment. She made similar promises to me, her voice clear and strong despite the tears that ran down her cheeks. But it was what happened next that transformed our desperate gamble into something miraculous. Father Aldrich had just pronounced us husband and wife when the first bell began to ring. It was impossible, of course. The chapel had been abandoned for decades, its bell tower empty and silent for longer than anyone could remember. Yet there it was, a clear, sweet sound that seemed to come from directly above our heads, ringing out across the countryside with a clarity that made my heart skip in my chest. We all froze, staring upward at the broken rafters where no bell could possibly be, as the sound continued. It was not the harsh clang of an alarm or the measured toll of a funeral bell, but something else entirely, something that filled the ruined space with warmth and light despite the gray morning sky. One bell became two, then three, then a whole carillon of ghostly chimes that seemed to celebrate our union with a joy that defied explanation. Tabitha fell to her knees, crossing herself and whispering prayers in Latin that I had not heard since childhood. Marcus, who had always been a practical man with little patience for superstition, stood transfixed with his mouth hanging open. Father Aldrich raised his trembling hands toward the sound, tears streaming down his weathered face, as he proclaimed it a miracle, a sign of divine approval for what we had done. But it was Gwyneth's reaction that moved me most. She looked up at the source of that impossible music with such wonder and gratitude in her eyes, and whispered that her grandmother had always told her that God would send a sign when love was truly blessed. The bells, she said, were heaven's wedding gift to us, a promise that no earthly power could undo what had been sanctified by divine will. Hit that like button if you believe love can overcome any obstacle. The sound continued for perhaps 5 minutes, though it felt like hours, before gradually fading into silence. In the quiet that followed, we could hear something else, the distant sound of horses and shouting voices that meant Whitmore's search party was getting closer. Our moment of miracle was over, and we were back to the harsh realities of our situation. We were married now, but we were still fugitives, and our new legal status might mean nothing if we were captured before we could present our case properly. Father Albert pressed a hastily written marriage certificate into my hands, signed by himself and our witnesses, before melting back into the forest with the skill of a man who had been hunted for years. Tabitha kissed Gwyneth farewell and departed in the opposite direction, planning to make her way to relatives in the north who might shelter her until the current persecution passed. Marcus returned to my estate to maintain the fiction that I had been there all morning, leaving Gwyneth and me to face whatever came next together. We had perhaps an hour before the search parties would find us, and we used that time to make our way toward the village square, where we planned to present ourselves publicly as husband and wife. It was a calculated risk, but I believed that appearing voluntarily, surrounded by witnesses, would give us a better chance than being captured in flight like common criminals. The bells, I hoped, had been heard throughout the region, and people would be curious about their meaning. We were right about the curiosity. By the time we reached the village, a crowd had already gathered, all of them talking excitedly about the mysterious bells that had rung from the ruined chapel. Some claimed it was a sign of God's displeasure with the recent persecutions. Others suggested it meant the old faith was returning to England, but all of them seemed touched by something they could not quite explain. When Gwyneth and I walked into the square hand in hand, a hush fell over the crowd. She still bore the Heretic's brand on her forehead, and I was known to everyone as a respectable landowner who should have been safely in his manor house, not walking publicly with a condemned prisoner. We made an unlikely pair, but there was something in our bearing, some quality of absolute certainty and peace, that made people step back rather than challenge us. Magistrate Whitmore arrived minutes later at the head of a company of armed men, his face dark with fury at the failure of his carefully planned execution. When he saw Gwyneth standing free in the village square, he began shouting orders for her immediate arrest, but I stepped forward and presented him with our marriage certificate. The crowd pressed closer, eager to hear what was happening, as I announced in a clear voice that Gwyneth Ravenscroft was now Gwyneth Thornwick, my lawfully wedded wife, married in the sight of God and man. Whitmore's reaction was everything I had hoped for and feared. He turned purple with rage, declaring that no marriage performed by a Catholic priest could be legal under English law, that I had committed treason by aiding a condemned heretic, and that we would both burn together for our defiance of royal authority. But even as he spoke, I could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. The legal questions surrounding our marriage were complex, and he was not sure of his ground. More importantly, the crowd was beginning to turn against him. The mysterious bells had touched something deep in the hearts of our neighbors, and they were no longer content to watch silently as young people were destroyed for their beliefs. Someone in the back began to clap slowly, others joined in, and soon the entire square was filled with applause for our courage and defiance. Whitmore found himself facing not two isolated criminals, but an entire community that had decided to make a stand. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by the arrival of an unexpected ally. Sir Edmund Fairfax, a nobleman from the county seat who outranked Whitmore significantly, had heard about the morning's events and ridden hard to investigate. He was a man of influence at court, known for his moderate views on religious matters, and his presence changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Sir Edmund listened carefully as I explained the circumstances of our marriage and the legal questions it raised. He examined our certificate, questioned our witnesses, and most importantly, he had heard the bells himself while riding toward the village. That supernatural endorsement, combined with the legal complexities and the clear sentiment of the local population, convinced him that this matter required more careful consideration than Whitmore's summary justice could provide. The final resolution came not through legal arguments or political maneuvering, but through the simple power of love made manifest. As we stood there in the village square, surrounded by people who had chosen to support us despite the risks, Gwyneth took my hand and spoke directly to Magistrate Widmore. She told him that she bore no hatred toward him or anyone else who had persecuted her, that she understood he believed he was serving God and country in his own way. But she also told him something that silenced his protests and touched the hearts of everyone who heard her. She said that the bells that morning had rung not just for our marriage, but for all the love that had been lost to fear and hatred, for all the young people who had died for their beliefs, for all the families torn apart by suspicion and persecution. They were a reminder, she said, that love was stronger than death, faith more powerful than fear, and hope more enduring than despair. Sir Edmund declared that the legal questions surrounding our marriage would require review by higher authorities, and that, until such time, we would remain free under his personal protection. Widmore had no choice but to accept this decision, though his expression promised that this was not the end of his pursuit. But we had won something more valuable than legal victory that day. We had won the support of our community and the knowledge that we had acted with courage when it mattered most. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales of love that defied impossible odds. The months that followed were not easy, but they were filled with a happiness I had never imagined possible. Gwyneth and I made a new home together, not in the grand manor where I had grown up, but in a simple cottage where we could live according to our consciences without bringing danger to others. We learned that love, when it is real and deep and willing to sacrifice everything for its object, creates its own sanctuary that no earthly power can truly breach. The bells never rang again, but we carried their music in our hearts, a reminder that some things are too sacred to be destroyed by the fears and hatreds of any age.